Her letters carried the hopes and secrets of the whole village, but one envelope held the truth someone would kill to bury. Welcome to the series of Driftcowit Tales. Let's begin with Chapter 1. Chapter 1, A Letter Not Delivered. The dawn mist drifted low across Marleycombe High Street, wrapping the cobbled lane in a pale blue hush. A milk cart rattled past the churchyard, and the sea, faintly visible beyond the rooftops, whispered like a secret too tired to tell. From the open door of the post office came the faint smell of damp paper and tea leaves. It was the morning Mrs. Edith Greaves was first missed. Ordinarily, the postmistress arrived before 6, as punctual as the church bell that marked each hour. She would sort the letters, hum an old wartime tune, and brew a pot of tea on the small spirit stove beside her desk. But on that gray Thursday morning, the stove was cold, the counter empty, and the letters still lay unsorted in their wicker tray. Mrs. Pratt, who ran the bakery opposite, noticed first. "That's odd," she muttered to herself, squinting through the fogged window. "She's never late, not even when the vicar's clock stopped last winter." By 6:30, the lane had gathered its usual cluster of early risers, the butcher's boy, 2 fishermen, and a delivery man, all pausing at the sight of the unopened post office. The little red post box beside the door gleamed weightily under the street lamp, stuffed with fresh envelopes that had not yet been cleared. By 8, word had reached the inn. Miss Marple, seated in the corner of the breakfast room, looked up from her porridge when the maid whispered the news. "The postmistress missing, you say? Since when?" The maid, a young Devon girl named Elsie, frowned. "Since this morning, ma'am. Mrs. Pratt's in a state over it. They say her door was unlocked, but there's no sign she ever came home last night." Miss Marple, visiting Marleycombe for a fortnight to rest her nerves, set down her spoon thoughtfully. Few things, she believed, happened in a small village without reason, and fewer still without witnesses. By 9:30, Inspector Elias Graves arrived from Exeter in his mud-splashed motor car. The villagers watched curiously as he crossed the lane, his heavy coat glistening with drizzle. Miss Marple, knitting in the inn sitting-room window, noted his deliberate step, the kind of man who thought before speaking. She met him formally later that morning, when he stopped in to question the guests. "You'll forgive me, ma'am," he said politely, "but I'm asking everyone who might have seen or heard anything unusual after 8 last evening." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "An excellent procedure, Inspector. Though I suspect you'll find the unusual in Marleycombe can be quite ordinary when viewed closely." He blinked, uncertain whether she was teasing him. "Did you notice anything yourself, Miss Marple?" "I'm staying with Mrs. Charlotte Dane. I did hear the clock strike 10 and some footsteps on the road. Slow ones, as if someone were carrying something heavy. But I assumed it was one of the fishermen returning late." The inspector made a note. "Anything else?" She hesitated. "Yes. I thought I heard the seagulls cry rather suddenly, as if startled. It was close to the post office direction." He raised his brows. "Noted, Miss Marple. You've a sharp ear." "Oh, not sharp," she said with a soft chuckle. "Merely accustomed to listening." By afternoon, the village buzzed with speculation. Mrs. Pratt insisted Edith had been taken by smugglers, those men by the quay, always whispering. Mr. Harold Dane, the grocer, said she'd probably gone to Exeter to visit her niece. Others whispered darker things. A love affair, a scandal, perhaps even the discovery of something she wasn't meant to see. Miss Marple found herself standing by the red post-box at dusk, looking at the faint smear of fingerprints on its lid. The fog had thickened again, wrapping the street in ghostly silence. A soft voice spoke behind her. "You're Miss Marple, aren't you?" She turned. It was Vera Lapham, the young widow who assisted at the post office 3 days a week. Her coat was too thin for the cold, her gloved hands trembling as she held a small envelope. "She told me to burn this," Vera said quietly. "But I couldn't. It's addressed to Major Robert Sinclair." Miss Marple's blue eyes flickered. "The gentleman who runs the inn?" "Yes. She said it was private, but she never sent it." "May I see?" Vera hesitated, then handed it over. The handwriting was neat, careful, and unmistakably feminine. Miss Marple noted the postmark, none, and the faint scent of lavender soap. She did not open it. "You were quite right not to burn it, my dear. Sometimes the truth hides in the smallest of papers." Just then the church bell tolled 6. Vera jumped. "I keep thinking she'll walk in again, apron and all, asking for her letters. She wasn't the sort to simply vanish, Miss Marple. She had her routines." Miss Marple nodded gently. "So do most crimes, my dear. They are nothing more than routines gone wrong." That night rain fell over Marleycombe, turning the cobbles slick and silver. Miss Marple sat by the inn's fire with her knitting, the unopened letter resting beside her teacup. From her seat she could see the post office across the square, dark now, except for a faint glimmer of light near the back window. She rose, wrapped her shawl, and crossed the street under her umbrella. The door of the post office was locked, but a side gate led into the small garden. Behind it, she stepped carefully through the puddles, the air thick with the scent of seaweed and wet roses. Through the window she saw movement, not of a person, but a flicker of flame. Someone had set a small fire in the stove. Then a man's shadow passed across the light. Miss Marple froze. The shape paused, too, as if sensing her presence, before the flame was quickly doused. The window went dark. She waited, heart steady but alert. After a long moment she heard the creak of the back door, then silence. Whoever it was had slipped away into the night. She turned to leave, and nearly stepped on something half buried in the wet earth. Kneeling, she brushed aside the mud. It was a small leather satchel, damp but intact. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with string, all addressed to men who had died in the war. Miss Marple returned to the inn quietly, the satchel hidden beneath her coat. As the fire hissed and the wind rattled the shutters, she studied the names on the envelopes. Each letter had been written by different hands, but all bore one signature, E. Greaves. Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Ah," she murmured, "so that was your secret, my dear. You never stopped writing to the ones who couldn't come home." She looked toward the dark window. Somewhere out there someone had known, and that knowledge had driven them to act. The postmistress of Marleycombe had not simply vanished. She had been silenced. And Miss Marple, serene as ever, began to knit again, her mind already following the quiet, precise rhythm of clues. Chapter 2. The Letter to the Major. The morning after the storm broke with a hesitant, pale light, the sea still restless from the night's rain. Marleycombe's lanes gleamed, slick and empty. The church bell rang for early prayers, and smoke rose thinly from the chimneys, curling like questions no one wished to ask aloud. Miss Marple was already awake. She sat near the window of her small room at the inn, a teacup steaming on the sill beside her knitting bag. On the table lay the satchel she had found in the garden behind the post office, now carefully dried, its contents neatly stacked, 34 letters, all addressed to soldiers who would never read them. Each bore the same neat, feminine handwriting, Edith Greaves's, and most were dated between 1941 and 1944, the darkest years of the war. But there was one envelope separate from the rest, sealed with a faint trace of lavender scent, addressed simply, Major Robert Sinclair, the Admiral's Arms, Marleycombe on Sea. Miss Marple touched the paper gently, as if the very ink might tell its story if treated kindly enough. She was still studying the letter when a brisk knock sounded at her door. "Come in," she said softly. Inspector Elias Greaves entered, hat in hand. His gray eyes, though tired, held respect. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I thought I might have a word before the village wakes fully. Mrs. Pratt's already telling everyone that German spies have carried off the postmistress." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "In my experience, Inspector, German spies are blamed for far too many missing cats and missing people. Do sit down." He took the chair opposite, glancing toward the papers spread before her. "You've been busy, I see." "I merely tidied up what someone had untidily left behind," she replied. "You'll find these letters rather curious." He leaned forward. "Where did you find them?" "In the postmistress's back garden, half buried as though someone meant to hide them but was interrupted." Greaves carefully examined the stack, his brow furrowing. "All addressed to the deceased. That's unusual." "Not if you think of it as a kindness," said Miss Marple. During the war, Mrs. Greaves lost many young men she had known since childhood. I suspect she continued writing to them, letters she never sent, but could not bear to destroy. The inspector nodded slowly. "A sentimental soul." "Yes, but sentimentality is rarely what kills." Someone feared what might be inside one of those letters. Greaves looked up. "You believe her disappearance is tied to this?" "I do." Miss Marple lifted the lavender-scented envelope. "And I suspect this one is the key." Later that morning, they crossed the square to the Admiral's Arms, the old inn, run by Major Robert Sinclair. The Major stood behind the bar polishing a glass, his trim mustache and military posture still intact despite the fading years. He was a man of habits, the sort who ironed his newspaper before reading it. "Good morning, Major," said Greaves. "We'd like a few minutes of your time." "Of course, Inspector." His eyes flicked briefly to Miss Marple. "And Miss Marple, isn't it? You've been causing quite a stir already." "Oh, dear," she said mildly. "That was never my intention. I merely noticed things." "Indeed," said the Major. "One hopes you notice when people overstep curiosity into gossip." The remark was sharp, but Miss Marple only smiled. "Gossip, Major, is often truth in untidy clothing." He gave a dry chuckle despite himself. "Touché. Now then, what can I do for you both?" Greaves produced the sealed envelope. "This was found among Mrs. Greaves's possessions. It's addressed to you." The Major's expression froze for an instant. He took the envelope, turning it over in his large, steady hands. "I've no idea why she'd write to me," he said at last. "Are you certain of that?" asked Miss Marple gently. "You both served the country, after all, in your own ways." Sinclair hesitated, then sighed. "Mrs. Greaves was a friend. We worked together. During the war, though few in the village would know it, she helped with the correspondence network. Messages disguised as harmless letters to families abroad. Small intelligence relays for the Admiralty, nothing more." Graves's eyes narrowed. "You're saying she was involved in wartime intelligence?" "Yes, but in a minor capacity. After the war, the whole thing was disbanded. I thought all her notes had been destroyed." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And if one was not?" He looked down at the envelope again, lips pressed thin. "Then someone might wish to silence her." Graves took a step closer. "Major, you'll understand that I'll need to open that letter." The Major hesitated, then passed it over without protest. Graves broke the seal carefully. Inside was a single sheet, written in Mrs. Greaves's neat script. "Robert, they've begun asking again about the 1943 parcels. I cannot live with it on my conscience. If they come, tell them the truth. that it was never gold we smuggled through the mail, but mercy. Greaves exhaled softly. Mercy, he repeated. She means the refugee letters. We used false names to bring children out of Belgium, adoption papers disguised as postal manifests. Miss Marple's eyes softened. A brave act, Major, but such secrets do not always remain heroic in peacetime. Greaves nodded grimly. Some men profited from those same routes after the war, smuggling currency, even artifacts. If one of them thought Edith might talk, then she would be a danger, Miss Marple finished quietly. By afternoon, the inspector had taken statements from the major and the staff. Miss Marple, meanwhile, walked the village lane toward the cliff path, the sea wind tugging at her hat. She often found that puzzles resolved themselves best when given fresh air. Halfway up the path she noticed footprints in the damp sand, 2 sets. One light, narrow, a woman's, likely Edith's, and another larger, booted, stopping near the edge where the ground crumbled into the sea below. Beside the prints lay a single object, a small brass button with a faint military crest. She bent and picked it up. When she returned to the village, she found Inspector Greaves waiting outside the post office. "We've searched her cottage," he said quietly. "Her purse, keys, even her coat are still there. It's as if she stepped out for a moment and never came back." Miss Marple held out the button. Perhaps she met someone she trusted, someone in uniform. He examined it. A military button. Could be old stock, but I'll have it checked. They walked together down the quiet street, the sound of gulls overhead. "You think it's murder, don't you?" Greaves said at last. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Murder, Inspector, is rather like knitting. A single dropped stitch may unravel the whole pattern, and the killer always leaves one." That evening, as dusk returned to Marleycombe, Miss Marple sat again by the inn's fire, her knitting needles clicking softly. Major Sinclair was at the bar, silent and brooding. Vera Latham slipped in quietly, carrying a parcel. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "I found this in the drawer beneath the counter at the post office. It's a ledger, names, dates, foreign addresses. Mrs. Greaves must have hidden it." Miss Marple opened the cover. "Ah," she murmured, "this is no ordinary record. These are the refugee children, the ones she helped save." "But why hide it?" Vera asked. "Because someone else used the same network for greed instead of good," Miss Marple said softly. "And when Edith found out, she became the only witness to their guilt." She looked toward the window where rain had begun again, fine and silvery. Tomorrow, Inspector Greaves must ask who benefited from those wartime parcels, and who lost when they stopped. Her needles clicked once more, steady as thought itself. "Because, my dear Vera," she said quietly, "it's never the war that destroys a village's peace. It's what the war left behind." Chapter 3. The Footprints by the Sea. The next morning dawned pale and sharp, the kind of coastal day when every sound carried far, the cry of gulls, the rhythmic crash of waves, and the creak of wooden shutters opening to the breeze. The storm had washed the air clean, but the village seemed uneasy, its usual gossip replaced by low murmurs and cautious glances toward the sea. Miss Marple stood at the window of the inn's breakfast-room, gazing out at the gray horizon. The tide was out, revealing wide stretches of sand and the jagged black rocks below the cliff path. Somewhere down there, she thought, the truth waited, quiet, cold, and stubborn, like the sea itself. Inspector Greaves joined her a few moments later, his hat in hand. "You were right about the footprints," he said. "They lead almost to the cliff's edge, then vanish. The ground's unstable there. We've had men searching since dawn. So far, nothing." Miss Marple's voice was calm. "And the brass button?" He took it from his pocket, holding it up to the light. "Confirmed. British Army, Royal Engineers, standard issue until 1944. Our Major Sinclair would have worn these once, though hundreds of men did. Still, it's a start." She nodded. "And a reminder that not every uniform signifies honor." Greaves sighed. "If only we had a motive clearer than wartime ghosts. I can't hold Sinclair on sentiment." "Nor should you," Miss Marple said gently. "But perhaps the past is not finished speaking." By mid-morning they stood together at the cliff path. The wind tugged at Miss Marple's hat, and she leaned slightly on her parasol as she surveyed the ground. The footprints were still visible in the damp sand, one set lighter, smaller, clearly a woman's, the other heavier, the impression of boots. She traced them with her eyes. "They walked side by side," she murmured. "Not a struggle, not a chase." She trusted whoever accompanied her. Greaves nodded. "Agreed. But to come this far in the dark?" "She may have come to post a letter," said Miss Marple softly. "Or to bury one." He frowned. "You think she was blackmailed?" "I think," she said, "that Mrs. Greaves discovered something during her duties. The post office is a most revealing place, Inspector. People confide more to envelopes than to priests. Suppose she recognized a familiar name among the parcels smuggled during the war, one that shouldn't have been there?" Graves's eyes narrowed. "You mean someone used her network to send contraband, gold, perhaps, or stolen art?" "Precisely. And when peace came, such men would not wish their peacetime reputations spoiled by wartime mischief." The wind rose suddenly, whipping her words away. Miss Marple steadied herself, her gaze fixed on the edge of the cliff. Something pale caught her eye near a rock. She moved closer and stooped. It was a torn scrap of blue fabric. "From a woman's dress," she murmured, holding it out. "Cotton, good quality. See the stitching? Domestic, not factory-made. I recall Mrs. Greaves wearing a blue frock on the day she vanished." Greaves examined it grimly. "We'll search the shoreline again at low tide. Maybe the sea has kept something else." Miss Marple's tone was soft but firm. "If she fell, Inspector, it was no accident, but perhaps it was made to look like one." He gave her a long look. "You think someone arranged a meeting here, someone she trusted?" "Yes," she said. "And I believe that someone wanted what she kept most closely. Not gold, but words, a ledger. A record of every name, every parcel. Proof." Graves exhaled. "The ledger Vera Latham found." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. And now the question is, who knew she had kept it?" They returned to the village by noon. The air smelled of salt and fresh bread from Mrs. Pratt's bakery. The woman herself waved them down eagerly, flowers still dusting her apron. "Oh, Inspector, Miss Marple, you'll never believe what I heard this morning." Miss Marple smiled politely. "We so seldom do, Mrs. Pratt, but please, go on." Mrs. Pratt leaned closer, lowering her voice. "That Vera girl, she was seen talking to Major Sinclair last night outside the inn, just before the lamps went out. Looked mighty serious, too." "Did she indeed?" said Miss Marple. "Thank you, Mrs. Pratt. You're always most observant." When they left her, Graves muttered, "She's half the village's alarm bell." "Sometimes alarm bells are useful," Miss Marple replied mildly, "if one listens past the noise." That afternoon Vera came to the inn carrying a small paper bag. Her face was pale, her eyes sleepless. "I heard you went down to the cliffs," she said quietly. "I was afraid you'd find." Miss Marple took her hand. "My dear, what we found was only wind and footprints. But tell me, why were you speaking with Major Sinclair last night?" Vera hesitated. "He asked me to bring him the ledger, the one I found under the counter. He said it wasn't safe in my keeping." Graves frowned. "And did you give it to him?" She shook her head quickly. "No, I didn't trust him. Something in his manner, he looked frightened. I told him I'd locked it away." "Very wise," said Miss Marple approvingly. "And where did you lock it?" "In the church vestry cupboard," she whispered. "Father Kent let me. He doesn't know what it is." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Excellent. The church is the one place in Marleycombe no one would dare search openly." Greaves nodded. "Then our next step is clear. We'll examine the ledger ourselves before the Major or anyone else can touch it." Evening fell quickly, painting the village in mauve and gold. The three of them, Miss Marple, Inspector Greaves, and Vera, met at the church under the slow toll of the 6 o'clock bell. The old stone walls smelled faintly of sea salt and candle wax. Father Kent had left the vestry unlocked as promised. Vera retrieved the ledger from the cupboard, her hands trembling slightly. Miss Marple laid it on the wooden table beneath the window and opened it carefully. Rows of names filled the pages. Children's names, families, coded addresses. But at the back, several entries stood out. April 1944, Parcel 17B, recipient R.S., contents, valuables. April 1944, Parcel 18A, recipient V.L., contents, jewelry. Inspector Greaves frowned. R.S. could be Robert Sinclair. "And V.O.," Miss Marple murmured, glancing at Vera. "Could that be your initials?" Vera's face blanched. "I swear I know nothing about that. I was a child then." Miss Marple's tone was gentle. "I believe you, my dear. But someone has used your name, perhaps to divert suspicion. This ledger is a list of those who profited under cover of mercy." Greaves tapped the page. "So Edith Greaves discovered this and confronted Sinclair." "Quite possibly," said Miss Marple. "And she intended to reveal it. Which means the Major isn't merely hiding guilt, he's hiding fear. Fear of exposure." Just then a sound outside made them all freeze, the faint creak of the church door. Greaves moved quietly to the entrance, his torchlight sweeping across the aisle. But the door stood empty, only the wind whistling through. When he turned back, Miss Marple was closing the ledger carefully. "Inspector," she said calmly, "if I'm not mistaken, we are being watched. And whoever it is knows that this ledger is the key to murder." They left the church together, locking the door behind them. The night mist was gathering again, silver in the lamplight. From somewhere near the harbor came the faint echo of footsteps, slow, deliberate, vanishing into fog. Miss Marple tightened her shawl. "Tomorrow, Inspector," she said softly, "we must pay another visit to the Major, for I believe Mrs. Greaves's final journey began not at the post office, but from his own doorstep." Greaves glanced at her. "And the footprints by the sea?" "They tell a story, Inspector," Miss Marple replied. "But the sea always leaves the last line unsaid. We must learn to read what the tide has taken." Chapter 4. The Ledger of Mercy. By the next morning the mist had lifted from the sea, but Marleycombe felt no clearer. Word of the postmistress's disappearance had spread beyond the village. A van from the Exeter Constabulary stood near the church, and small groups of villagers lingered by the quay, whispering in anxious tones. Miss Marple sat in the inn's breakfast room, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. Before her lay the small brass button, the torn scrap of blue fabric, and a few neat notes written in her delicate hand. Inspector Greaves joined her soon after, his face tired but alert. "You've slept little, Inspector," she said gently. He smiled faintly. "That's the advantage of a conscience, Miss Marple. It won't rest until it has an answer. I've questioned Major Sinclair again. He insists he hasn't left the inn in 2 nights, though no one can confirm it. The staff were asleep." "And Vera Latham?" "She's frightened, but she's truthful. I believe she really did lock the ledger in the church vestry. We'll keep it there for now, under my supervision." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "A wise precaution. Sometimes evidence must be protected not only from criminals, but from well-meaning fools." She leaned back, her eyes thoughtful. "Tell me, Inspector, Have you looked into the name R.S.? Greaves sighed. We've found records showing that during the war, Sinclair handled coded shipments for naval intelligence, most legitimate, some not. After 45, the paperwork vanishes. But there's something else. The initials V.L., not Vera Latham, as we feared, match another person entirely. He opened his notebook. Victor Latham, her late husband's brother, a wartime smuggler caught selling foreign coins in London, disappeared before his trial in 1946. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-air. "Ah," she said softly, "the sins of the dead have a curious way of haunting the innocent." By noon, they were once again at the Admiral's Arms. Major Sinclair greeted them stiffly, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. "If you've come to accuse me again, Inspector, I'll save you the trouble. I told you the truth yesterday." Greaves remained calm. "And yet, Major, you omitted that you handled certain coded shipments marked R.S. and V." Sinclair's jaw tightened. "Old Admiralty codes. They meant nothing designations for regions, not people." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Perhaps. Yet how inconvenient that they match your own initials and those of a certain Mr. Victor Latham." The Major froze, the color draining slightly from his face. "Latham, yes, I remember him. A reckless fellow. I warned Edith not to trust him." "Did she?" Miss Marple asked softly. He hesitated. "At first, yes. He charmed her. Said he wanted to send parcels abroad, donations for refugees. But I later learned he was slipping. Gold coins among the relief packages. I told her to stop helping him. And did she?" "I thought so," Sinclair said bitterly, "but perhaps she couldn't bear to think badly of him. When he fled England, she blamed herself. She even wrote letters to him, letters that never could be posted." Miss Marple's eyes shone with quiet pity. So the postmistress who served truth and duty found herself deceived by kindness. And when she discovered the truth years later, she sought to set it right. "She meant to confess everything," Sinclair admitted. "She told me last week she'd written it all down, in case something happened to her." Greaves leaned forward. "Where?" "I don't know. She said she'd keep it close to the church. I assumed she meant spiritually, not literally." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with the inspector. "Then she did trust you." "Major, enough to warn you." And that, I think, was her fatal mistake. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked alone through the churchyard. The sea shimmered under pale sunlight. Beyond the lych gate she could hear children playing on the green. It was the sort of peace that hid worry underneath. She paused before a weathered stone bench near the wall. Something about the earth beneath it looked disturbed. A faint hollow, the kind one notices only by habit. She knelt, brushing aside a few leaves, and found a small tin box wrapped in cloth. When she opened it, her breath caught. Inside lay another section of the ledger, torn out and hidden, along with a short note, written in Mrs. Greaves's careful hand. "If anything should happen to me, show this to Inspector Greaves. Tell him the truth lies not at sea, but in the ashes." Miss Marple rose slowly, heart steady, mind racing. Ashes. Not at sea, but fire. She returned at once to the post office, where Greaves was examining the counter. "Inspector," she said quietly, "did you ever notice the small stove behind her desk?" He nodded. "Yes, the constable found it cold when we arrived that morning." "Then I suggest we look inside it again," she said, very carefully. Greaves called for a constable, and together they examined the soot-filled stove. Beneath the ashes something glinted faintly. Half-burnt pages, charred but legible. Miss Marple's gloved fingers lifted one delicately. "Cannot forgive myself for helping Victor again. He begged me, said it was for his brother's widow. I never suspected the gold was stolen." She looked up. So Vera Latham's name was used to disguise Victor's crimes. Edith learned the truth. perhaps through Sinclair, and feared exposure. But someone else feared she might speak. Greaves nodded grimly. Someone who knew Victor Latham's dealings and still profits from them. Miss Marple's voice lowered. Indeed, and who better than the man who handled his accounts, Major Sinclair? That evening the inn was unusually quiet. A storm gathered again beyond the cliffs, thunder rumbling like distant drums. Greaves and Miss Marple entered the parlor together. Sinclair sat alone by the fire, a glass of brandy untouched at his elbow. "I suppose you've come to arrest me," he said quietly. "Not yet," Greaves replied, "but I'd appreciate the truth before I do." Sinclair's gaze flickered toward the flames. "I never meant to harm her. She came to me the night she disappeared. Said she'd told the police everything, that the past couldn't stay buried. I begged her not to. She left, furious. I followed to make her listen, then she slipped." "Slipped?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "Yes," he whispered, "at the cliffs." It was dark, raining. She stumbled and fell. I tried to reach her, but she was gone." Graves's voice was sharp. "Then why not report it?" "Because no one would believe me," Sinclair said hoarsely. "And because those letters, her letters to the dead, they would condemn her as mad and me as her accomplice. I buried the satchel in her garden, hoping to keep her name clean." Miss Marple studied him closely. There was sorrow in his eyes, but also guilt of another kind. "Major," she said gently, "you may not have killed her by intent, but concealment is a cruelty of its own. The truth is owed to the living." He bowed his head. "Then I'll tell it all. To the inspector, to anyone who'll listen." Outside the wind rose again, rattling the windows. Miss Marple turned to the fire, the flames crackling softly. "So that was what she meant by ashes," she murmured. "The remnants of her confession, half burnt yet still bearing witness." Greaves folded his notebook. "You've done it again, Miss Marple. I'd have called it an accident. You saw the pattern." She smiled faintly. "One learns to read human nature, Inspector. It's rather like reading a letter. What matters is not always what's written, but what's left unsaid." Graves nodded. "There'll still be an inquest. The sea may yet give us her body." Miss Marple looked toward the window, where the rain had begun once more, soft as tears. "Perhaps it will," she said quietly. "But whether or not she returns, her letters have already spoken for her, with mercy and with truth." Chapter 5. The Storm over Marleycombe. That evening, the wind from the channel swept across Marleycombe like a living thing, howling through chimneys, slamming shutters, tossing salt spray against the windows of the inn. It was the kind of storm that made old villagers mutter about bad luck and lost souls. Miss Marple sat by the hearth, her knitting on her lap, though she scarcely moved her needles. Her thoughts were on the cliffs, on Edith Greaves, and on the truth that was still half hidden, like a stone glimpsed beneath rushing water. Inspector Graves entered, his coat dripping rain. "The storm's growing worse," he said grimly, "and the sea's turning up debris from the last gale. A fisherman down by the cove found part of a mailbag tangled in seaweed, stamped Marleycombe Post Office." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Then the sea has begun to speak." Graves nodded. "We're bringing it up now. If there's anything left inside, we'll know by morning." "Do be careful, Inspector," she said softly. "The sea keeps secrets for a reason, and sometimes when it returns them, it demands another price." The wind rattled the windows so fiercely that the inn seemed to shiver. Major Sinclair was in the parlor again, sitting rigidly with a brandy he hadn't touched. He looked 10 years older than the day before. "You've heard," he said without looking up. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "The sea has returned one of Edith's postbags." He gave a bitter laugh. "Then she truly is gone. The sea takes everything here. Letters, truth, people. Miss Marple studied him quietly. "And yet, Major, it also returns things, half-burnt pages, buttons, and conscience." He glanced up sharply. "You think I don't feel it? I've not slept since that night. I see her face every time I close my eyes." "Remorse is a fine thing," Miss Marple said gently, "but it rarely comes alone. Tell me, Major, when Edith fell, did anyone else see you?" He hesitated too long. "No," he said finally. "No one." The next morning dawned dark and wild. The rain had ceased, but the sea boiled against the rocks, white and furious. Inspector Greaves sent word that the mailbag had been opened at the constable's office near the quay. Miss Marple and Vera Latham arrived together, cloaks pulled tight against the wind. Inside, the air smelled of salt and damp paper. On the table lay the recovered bag, torn and heavy with seawater. Greaves looked up. "We found letters addressed to families in London, most ruined, but one envelope survived." He held it out carefully. The ink was blurred, the paper swollen, but the name was still legible. "To Miss Vera Latham, Marleycombe, C." Vera gasped. "That's my name, but I never received a letter." Miss Marple examined it, written in Edith's hand again, postmarked 3 days before she vanished. Greaves gestured for her to open it. Vera's fingers shook as she unfolded the paper. Inside were just a few lines, smeared but readable. "My dear, if anything should happen to me, please remember that the past must not be repeated. The man who wronged your husband is still near. Beware the kindness of old friends." Vera's face went white. She meant the Major. Graves's jaw tightened. "Or someone using his friendship to hide behind it." Miss Marple's voice was calm. "We mustn't jump too quickly, my dear. Let us consider who else had reason to fear Edith's honesty." Vera frowned. "There's hardly anyone left who even knew about those parcels." "Except," Miss Marple said slowly, "those who handled their accounts." "And who is now responsible for the post office's finances since Edith disappeared?" Vera's eyes widened. "Mr. Harold Dane, the grocer. He keeps the village accounts, and he was helping Edith balance the ledgers since the war." Greaves looked up sharply. "Harold Dane served under Sinclair's command during the war. He'd have known about the smuggling routes." Miss Marple nodded. "And he's the one man who could have known." Edith was writing again. Her letters to the dead were all delivered through his shop before she took them home. By afternoon, the storm had eased, leaving the village drenched and shining. Miss Marple, Inspector Greaves, and Vera made their way to Harold Dane's grocery. The bell above the door jingled as they entered. Dane looked up from the counter. His once handsome face was drawn, his expression wary. "Inspector," he said, "if it's more questions, I've nothing new to tell you." Greaves stepped forward. "Perhaps you've forgotten to mention your connection with Victor Latham. You handled his remittances during the war." Dane stiffened. "Who told you that?" "Mrs. Greaves's records," said Miss Marple mildly. "Before they burned, they revealed enough." Dane's eyes flicked between them. She had no right to dig up all that again. It was finished." "Was it?" said Miss Marple softly. "When she threatened to reveal that you'd been diverting funds and hiding your brother-in-law's profits under charity shipments, what did you do?" "I warned her," he snapped. "I told her it would destroy everything. She wouldn't listen." Graves's voice hardened. "So you followed her that night to the cliffs?" Dane's hand trembled. "I only wanted to frighten her." "I swear it. She slipped. I tried to reach her, but she fell. The sea took her before I could even shout." Miss Marple regarded him sadly. "Then you returned and buried her satchel to hide what she'd found. The button from your old uniform came loose in the struggle. You never noticed." He sagged against the counter, face ashen. "It wasn't supposed to end like this." "No," Miss Marple said gently. Murder, even unintended, never is. That evening the village was quiet again. The constables took Dane away without resistance. Greaves lingered outside the post office, hat low against the drizzle. "She slipped, just as Sinclair said," he murmured. "But he wasn't the one there." Miss Marple nodded. "No, he only carried the guilt of silence. Dane carried the truth. Do you think he meant to kill her?" "I think," she said softly, "that he meant to keep his peace. And that's the same thing, sometimes." They stood for a moment watching the waves shimmer under the lantern light. Then Miss Marple spoke again, her tone almost tender. "You see, Inspector, in villages like Marleycombe, no sin ever truly dies. It merely waits, folded inside an envelope, sealed with good intentions." Later that night, in her small room at the inn, Miss Marple opened her notebook and wrote quietly by the glow of the oil lamp. "The tragedy of Marleycombe lies not in greed, but in remembrance. Those who could not forget and those who could not forgive met at the edge of the sea, and only the sea understood them both." She set down her pen, folded her knitting neatly beside her, and smiled faintly at the steady ticking of the clock. Outside the storm had passed, leaving only the hush of waves and the faint cry of gulls, a lullaby for a village that had, at last, unburdened its secrets. Chapter 6. The Last Letter from Marleycombe. A week after the storm, Marleycombe-on-Sea seemed to have exhaled at last. The gulls returned to their lazy circles over the harbor. The sea, calm again, sparkled faintly beneath a sky washed clean of sorrow. But to those who knew the truth, peace came not from forgetfulness, but from acceptance. Miss Marple stood outside the post office one quiet morning, watching 2 constables board up the door. The once bustling little building, the heart of the village, now felt like a shrine. The red post-box gleamed freshly polished, as if in silent tribute to the woman who had served it faithfully. Inspector Elias Greaves joined her, hat in hand. "The inquest's complete," he said. "They've ruled it accidental death with extenuating circumstances." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A gentle phrasing, Inspector. The law is sometimes kinder in words than in spirit." He nodded. "Harold Danes confessed everything. He's been charged with manslaughter. He'll serve time, though not as long as a guilty conscience would have him." "The conscience is the truest jailer," Miss Marple murmured. Greaves looked at the sea. "Sinclair's leaving today. He's asked to speak with you before he goes." She nodded. "I rather thought he would." The major was waiting at the quay, his suitcase beside him, his figure straight despite the weariness in his face. The morning ferry puffed steam in the distance, ready to take him toward Exeter, and he said, "Perhaps onwards to Scotland. Somewhere quiet where I can live among ghosts that aren't mine." "Miss Marple," he greeted softly, "I wanted to thank you. Not for accusing me, you were right to, but for sparing me the weight of suspicion I deserved." She smiled kindly. "Guilt unspoken is heavier than guilt confessed, Major, but you have done one thing well. You cared for Mrs. Greaves's name when others would have buried it." He bowed slightly. "She was a good woman. Too good for the world we made during the war. She believed mercy could survive the mud and the lies." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "And she was right in the end. The sea may claim bodies, but mercy always finds its way ashore." The ferry bell rang. Sinclair took her hand briefly, a soldier's grip, firm, wordless, final. Then he boarded and vanished into the mist, his figure becoming part of the horizon. Later that afternoon, the village gathered in the churchyard for a small service. The vicar, Father Kent, spoke simply of duty and kindness, the virtues that live longest after we are gone. The few villagers who had once whispered gossip now bowed their heads with quiet shame. Vera Latham stood beside Miss Marple, holding a small bouquet of wild daisies. When the prayers were done, she placed them on the empty grave prepared in Edith Greaves's honor. "I still can't believe she's gone," Vera whispered. "She wrote letters for everyone else, but none for herself." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Perhaps she did, my dear. Some letters are meant to be found only by the right eyes." As if answering her words, Inspector Greaves approached, holding a small oilskin envelope. "The tide brought this in this morning," he said quietly. "Washed up near the cove. The handwriting's hers." Miss Marple took it carefully. The paper was softened by seawater, but, miraculously intact, the address read simply, "To whoever still listens in Marleycombe." She opened it, her fingers steady despite the faint tremor of age. Inside was a single page, the ink faded, the script wavering but unmistakably Edith's. "I have lived my life among letters, the words of others, their hopes, their lives, their love, and I have learned that truth, like the tide, always returns, though often too late for comfort. If I am gone, let it not be for vengeance, but for forgiveness. Tell them that mercy once given can never be stolen, only delayed." A hush fell over those nearby as Miss Marple finished reading. The vicar crossed himself. Vera wiped her eyes. Greaves stood silently, hat pressed to his chest. Miss Marple folded the letter and returned it to its envelope. "She has, at last, posted her final message," she said softly, "and it has been delivered where it was most needed." That evening the inn was quieter than it had been in weeks. The regulars spoke in low voices, their gossip now gentler, touched with something like reverence. Miss Marple sat near the window overlooking the sea. A pot of tea steamed beside her, and the faint ticking of the mantel clock filled the silence. Inspector Greaves joined her once more. "I'll be returning to Exeter tomorrow," he said. "You've done my work for me again, Miss Marple. I'll have to start billing you as a consultant." She chuckled softly. "Oh, heavens, no. I prefer to keep my investigations strictly amateur. It gives me the freedom to think unprofessionally." Greaves laughed quietly, then grew thoughtful. "You know, I've seen my share of tragedies, but this one, it feels different. Less about crime, more about consequence." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. In villages such as this, murder seldom begins with hatred, Inspector. More often it begins with love, misplaced, misjudged, or misremembered." He looked at her curiously. "Do you ever tire of seeing so much sorrow?" She smiled faintly. "Oh, no. Because beneath it one always finds courage, and occasionally redemption. Even the smallest kindness can outlive a crime." As dusk fell, Miss Marple stepped outside. The street lamps flickered on one by one, their light glowing softly through the mist. She walked slowly toward the churchyard, her shawl pulled close around her shoulders. The red post-box stood gleaming under the lamplight, freshly painted by the constable that morning. Miss Marple paused beside it, running her hand gently over the brass slot. "Your work is done, my dear Edith," she murmured. "You've delivered your final post." She slipped something into the box, a single folded note, unaddressed, written in her neat hand. "Rest now, dear friend. Your village remembers you, and so shall I." The wind carried the faintest scent of salt and lilac from the sea, and the waves whispered softly against the shore. The next morning dawned golden and still. The mist was gone, and the church bells rang with a clarity Marleycombe hadn't heard in months. Children chased each other down the green. The baker's shop opened early, and Vera hung a small sign outside the post office window. "Marleycombe Post Office, reopening soon." Inside, the light fell gently on the counter, the empty pigeonholes, and the brass scales. On the wall, Miss Marple had asked that one small frame be hung, containing Edith Greaves's final letter. It read in graceful script, "Truth and mercy are the twin pillars of peace. deliver them often. Miss Marple stood at the threshold, smiling faintly, as the morning sun filled the room. "Well, my dear," she whispered, "your last delivery was the most important of all." Outside, the sea was calm, the gulls wheeling lazily in the bright air. Somewhere far off, a bell buoy chimed in slow rhythm with the waves, like the ticking of a vast, eternal clock. And Miss Marple, satisfied, turned back toward the inn, her mind already composing a letter to her friend in St. Mary Mead. A curious case, my dear Dolly, not of murder alone, but of forgiveness, and of a postmistress who, even in death, remembered to deliver hope. She folded her hands over her knitting bag, her heart peaceful. The mystery of Marleycombe was over, but its memory, like a well-written letter, would endure.